Welcome to our podcast. It's brought to you by the Touro Law Review and the Touro University Jacob D. Fuchsberg Law Center. Our guest today is Dean and Professor TIffany Graham, and she's going to speak with us about her work on the New York Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, as it's examined a number of significant issues over the past several years. Professor Graham, welcome.
Thank you.
So we do have a significant student audience, and so we like to begin by having our guest panelists tell us how they got to this point in their professional career. So Professor Graham, I invite you to do that.
Okay, well, if I speak generally and over the course of it, I started off in private practice, and because I frankly did not enjoy it, and I knew that what I enjoyed was being in an environment that was focused on students, because I had done various things when I was in law school that really gave me the opportunity to work with students who were younger than I was and who were new to the various institutions where I was. And I loved doing that kind of thing. So I started thinking very seriously about coming back into academia, and that was how I ended up there. So over the course of my career in academia, I have taught in Philadelphia, I've taught in Southern California, I've taught in South Dakota, and now I'm here in New York. And insofar as my work with the New York State Advisory Committee is concerned, that actually came about with luck. When I was in South Dakota, I was at the University of South Dakota School of Law, where I was primarily the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, but I also had teaching responsibilities. But beyond that, I also did volunteer work in the state that was connected to civil rights. In particular, I was doing work with the LGBTQ plus community in South Dakota, because I was very engaged and wanted to assist and provide support. And for whatever reason, I came to the attention of one of the individuals who was employed by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and who coordinated the South Dakota Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission. And I received a communication out of the blue and an invitation after a conversation to be the chair for the South Dakota Committee. Realistically, the South Dakota Committee at that point was moribund. There was very little that was happening, and I was very excited about the opportunity to investigate some of these civil rights issues that existed on the ground in South Dakota, because they were there and they were pretty profound. So while I was still there, the project that we began focused on maternal mortality rates among Native American women. But then I got the job at Touro. And so I had to walk away from my work in South Dakota, but luckily I received a recommendation to take a spot on the committee here in New York. There were openings, I was available, I had some experience, and so I ended up on the committee here when I moved here in 2020. So that's kind of in a nutshell how I got, from there to here, and in particular, how I ended up on the committee itself.
Well, as I moderate these podcasts, I'm always struck by the fact that a number of our panelists, they've remained flexible. I mean, they, in your case, going from private practice into academia. At the same time, they've followed their passion, which clearly you did, and you remain flexible geographically. And look how it's led you. You've been on several state advisory committees, which I imagine is rather unique, especially between South Dakota and New York. A state, that has really a small population, and then you come to New York, where you have one of the biggest states in the country. And so I think that's all to your credit, and probably has given you broader experience. You said in South Dakota, you dealt with Native American women and some issues that they had. I know when you've been on our committee in New York here, that is to say, New York Citizens Committee, for several years, dealt with a number of significant issues. So now, as we turn to the substance of our program, I invite you just to really choose an issue that you believe is significant and current, and just tell us about it.
When I first joined the committee, we focused on the racial disparities in eviction rates that existed in the state. We spent in total almost 2 years working on that, about a year and a half, and produced a fairly extensive report that dealt with those issues. But now what we are focusing on is racial disparities in the foster care system. And that has really been eye-opening for me. I will say that one of the things that's interesting about working on the committee in New York is the way that New York's, when you think about the way New York operates and the way that the committee functions, we always have to be mindful of the fact that upstate New York is almost another place in a way from everything that happens down here. And it's very easy to forget that because the population here is enormous, but also because so much of what happens in New York, whether you're talking about on a cultural level, on a legislative level, can be driven by what happens in the New York City metropolitan area. And so, as we do our work, we always have to be very attentive, very mindful to what's happening outside of the New York City metropolitan area to make sure that, number one, we really are serving the entire state, but two, so that we get a full picture of everything that's happening with respect to our civil rights concerns across the state. And so I will say that with the project that we are working on right now, we are, of course, focused on what's happening in New York City, but we have learned a lot about what's happening nationally with respect to racial disparities in the the child welfare system. So, of course, that encompasses the foster care system. But also looking at New York in particular, so much of the disparity, so much of the harm really has been it's been a factor here downstate. We have investigated what has happened upstate as well, but really a lot of our focus has been on what happens in New York City, what happens in Long Island, etc. And so in listening to experts, many of whom have personal experience in the system, we have people who are survivors of the child welfare system who lost contact with their birth families and were never able to reestablish that contact, who spent years in foster care, were subject to abuse, were subject to sexual assault, whose educational prospects were severely disrupted. They talk about all of these experiences when they come in and testify before us. But we've also heard what professional experts have had to say regarding the way the system works and why disparities occur. So as an initial matter, no one can deny the profoundness of the disparities that exist. We are not sort of focusing on all racial groups. We are focusing in this particular report on disparities with respect to Black kids, to Black families. And the reason for that is because those numbers are the worst. And when you look at the experiences of the people who find themselves really targeted by the child welfare system, one of the things that has hit me as being incredibly profound is that the disparities exist regardless of class. And so there is no question in my mind that white families are oftentimes experiencing many of the same kinds of pressures and tensions that might lead to the loss of your child. But white families are not being surveilled in the same way that Black families are. There is more attention that is directed to Black families for reasons related to implicit bias, explicit bias, whatever the case might be. But as a consequence of that greater attention, you see the disparities existing regardless of class. But also putting that.
If I may, Professor Clem, and so just if we could sort of recap a little bit.
Okay.
So you've listened to experts from all over the state, national as well, but one bottom line is there are significant problems in the New York metropolitan area, which includes Long Island. So as you focus on this disparity, I mean, at this point, it's almost hard for me to sort of try to put things in some kind of list that we could talk about. I mean, I suppose we could talk about impact, which you've mentioned, or specific problems, or factors that lead to this disparity, or possible ways out of it. I mean, or maybe a systemic reform. I mean, out of sort of that list of things, does anything try to bring some of these observations together?
Well, there's no real, well, actually, there's a raging debate that is happening amongst experts over whether you reform child welfare or whether you abolish the system as it exists. Now, of course, when you start talking about abolition, people freak out because we all have read the horrific stories of children who are subject to extraordinarily vicious forms of abuse in the home and who sometimes end up dead as a consequence of that. So the idea of abolition is, at first blush, absolutely rejected as an instinctive matter for a lot of people. The abolitionists are not suggesting that there be no system in place. What they are suggesting is the current system that exists is so profoundly broken that you just have to start over. And in the course of starting over, be mindful of the errors that were made and the biases that infected the current system, and let that guide you with respect to what new kind of system you are going to put in place. Now, of course, when you have that debate, when you have that conversation, one of the concerns is, whose interests are you prioritizing? Are you prioritizing the interests of the parents who don't want to lose their kids? Or are you prioritizing the interests of the kids who need to be safe and healthy and whole? And in having that debate, part of the response to that last question is, well, so often the thing that breaks kids is the loss of their families. And let me explain what I mean by that. When you start digging into the data and you look at what is actually happening, a lot of children are removed from their homes because of accusations of neglect in particular. But what that has often translated into is people losing their kids because they're poor. Now, of course, there is more to it. There are people who are poor and therefore unable to provide the resources, the care, et cetera, that is necessary to ensure that children get what they need in order to grow and thrive. You have people who don't necessarily have the skills that they need to be great parents. And the conversation that people have around that is, a lot of that is actually resolvable. Obviously, you can't fix the problems of poverty, but with proper resourcing and with proper support, especially financial support from whether it's the state government, the local government, the federal government, et cetera, there is the opportunity to provide additional financial structure for families, whether you're talking about some forms of welfare. There's also the opportunity to provide parents with the parenting skills that they need in order to ensure that their children get the support and the structure, et cetera, that they need in their lives. the idea is that there are solutions, they're deep solutions, they are structural solutions, they are hard solutions, but they are the kinds of solutions you can try to put in place in order to both support children in terms of what they need and families overall in terms of staying together. Thinking about Long Island, for instance, one of the things that has happened in Long Island, it started in Nassau County, and there is some interest in bringing it to Suffolk County. Governor Cuomo and I believe Governor Hochul as well expressed interest in taking the model from Nassau County and exporting it around the state. The idea of using blind processes when caseworkers are deciding whether or not to remove children from the home. And what studies have shown is that when Nassau County began using these blind processes for removal, the disparities between Black families and white families really sharply went down. And what that indicated was that, when they weren't acting in a blind capacity, caseworkers were allowing themselves to be impacted by race when they were deciding whether or not children ought to, in fact, be removed from the home. And so instead, when you have these blind removal processes, one, you take that off the table. But two, the other thing that's happening is when kids are removed, there is an emphasis on kinship placement and making sure that you work as hard as you possibly can to place kids with extended family members as opposed to putting them into the system. And so, Nassau County has really taken some great strides in trying to, number one, reduce the number of kids who are in foster care, but two, reduce the racial disparities that exist in the system, and they've gotten national attention for it. But then it's just one sort of way of thinking about some of the big issues, some of the big picture issues, and how they operate here.
Okay, if I may, especially given that Long Island is trying to propose a solution. Just I may have sort of interrupted you, taking you off track when you were describing the nature of the problem, the errors and biases, particularly as it relates to Black children. Mm-hmm. So, you've spoken generally about it, and maybe with some specifics as well. But, I invite you, if you want to be more specific with some of the errors and biases as they related to Black children, as you looked at your data. And then if we can bring it back, then I would ask you to explain a little bit more about the blind process, because that's not a term that many of us are familiar with. Mm-hmm. That sounds like a possible way of addressing the errors and biases as they relate to Black children. So maybe you could discuss the problem a little bit more before I interrupted you. And then tell us a little bit more about this blind process proposal and solution.
Okay, well, I will say my committee has not focused a great deal on the blind removal process. That's just something I happen to know, quite frankly, because I'm a Touro law student. I advised a student who was working with the foster care system in Nassau County, and I'm sorry, I think he was working in Suffolk County, and then he ended up writing a paper about what Nassau County does and how that might be exported into Suffolk County. So that's the primary source of my information from that perspective. But insofar as why this is happening to Black families, there's the old cliche when white people catch a cold, Black people catch pneumonia. We are used to a story where Black families who are subject to forms of trauma oftentimes experience it more intensely than do other families because of the biases that exist and have existed structurally in the nation, in the state, whatever the case might be. And so in looking at that, one of the things that we have seen is problems with mandated reporting. So over the years, the list of mandated reporters has steadily expanded. And when you expand the number of mandated reporters, two things come into play. One, people want to keep their jobs. And so if they see something that, you know, triggers their spidey senses, if you will, regarding the possibility of neglect or abuse, they report it. They have to. But what's also problematic is what I suggested earlier is implicit biases that, number one, persuade them to focus in on Black children or Black families more closely than they do other families, but two, to perhaps misperceive what they are seeing. And then when you layer on top of that the same kinds of biases that exist in law enforcement, that has an impact too, because of course, shouldn't say law enforcement. What I really should say is the enforcement officers who function within the child welfare system. That problem is simply replicated. One of the things that we have talked about on the committee is the fact that people have Fourth Amendment rights when folks from child welfare show up at the door and they want to come inside your home and they want to investigate, see whether or not the kids are safe. And they oftentimes do this without a warrant. And so, when you put these issues together, the biases that exist on the front end, implicit biases, but biases that exist on the front end, reporting as an initial matter, and then the biases that are reproduced on the investigatory side. And then when you layer on top of that, the failure to inform people regarding their rights, their constitutional rights, because Miranda warnings don't apply in the child welfare context, what you have is a series of factors that come together. I'm not even mentioning all of them, but a series of factors that come together and have a most profound impact on Black families because, again, of the focus on Black people as a whole, especially when it comes to accusations regarding the improprieties of one form or another.
All right. So let's, sometimes we don't realize we may have a little more information than our audience. Mandatory reporter, we know what that is, but would you mind explaining that? Because if you say that's sort of the triggering mechanism or that's the activation mechanism, and you feel there's an expansion of mandatory reporters in a way that sort of reinforces and continues bias, perhaps. So why don't you just please define mandatory reporter for us, maybe give us some examples, since that's part of the problem.
A mandatory reporter is someone who is by law required to report to law enforcement in whatever, whatever mechanism is used to communicate these concerns when they have when there is a possibility that a child is subject to neglect or abuse. And so think about teachers, think about doctors or other medical staff. So these are the kinds of people who are in the position of being mandatory reporters. But over time, again, that list has expanded. And so you have other people, perhaps other people in an educational setting, other people in a healthcare setting, daycare operators, et cetera. People in these kinds of settings, really anyone who I shouldn't say anyone, I'm going to be careful about that, but many people who find themselves in sustained contact with minors, these are the kinds of people who are ripe for being brought within the ambit of responsibility that state legislators create. So that's who mandatory reporters are.
And obviously, if they fail to report, then that jeopardizes their license, their livelihood. So I suppose there's a real incentive to frankly, to over-report.
Right, that's right, and that's part of the concern. So when we are doing our work, we develop the project. We decide, we vote in the committee and decide what we're going to focus on. Members of the committee will put various ideas on the table, and then we vote on what we're going to do. And then we spend the next however much time, a year or so, doing investigation. We take testimony, we do briefings, public briefings. They're all open to the public, they're noticed, and they're open to the public. And we hear from experts that we have invited to come and testify before us. We put their testimony in the record, and they talk about all the different things that are of interest to us in putting the report together. And we've heard from more than one expert in the course of our study of the foster care system that mandatory reporting is one of the biggest problems for the reasons that I have suggested. And one of the things that some reformers want to do is get rid of mandatory reporting altogether. Now, as a realistic matter, you're not going to convince a legislature to get rid of mandatory reporting. That's not going to fly politically, and it's not going to happen. But what you might be able to do is persuade legislators to rethink the size of that mandatory reporter list. And instead of having the wide scope that you do, remove some people from the list because it isn't necessary to keep them on that list. Now, of course, again, people might be horrified when they hear me say something like that, because again, what about the kids? What about the kids? And that is an absolutely fair and appropriate instinct to have. But it's also important to remember that the overwhelming majority, something like 90% of these cases, are neglect cases. And the neglect cases, more often than not, are simply a function of being poor. So many families are losing their kids because they're Black and they're poor. And it's just true. That's what the evidence is bearing out. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are intentionally going after poor families who are Black, but again, because of implicit biases, or because of a concern about implicit biases, there is a sense that goes a long way to explaining why Black families who are poor end up being caught up in the system in the way that they do, especially when you consider the fact that there are white poor families. And yes, white kids who are neglected and who are subject to abuse, they get removed as well, but they don't get removed at the same rate. And so unless one is to conclude that there is something uniquely and sociopathically wrong with Black people, then this disparity, especially across class, would suggest that maybe the problem is not Black families, but the over attention that is placed on Black families. Or the under attention directed toward white families.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's your fault.
When you talk about across class, are you saying that there's also disparity? Let's say, I mean, if most of this is related to poor and poverty, okay. But if we move into let's say even top 10%, top 5%, obviously there are Black families in that category and white families in that category, and every racial. But are you saying that the bias still exists even in, let's say, the top 10%, top 5%, whatever?
Absolutely. That surprised me too. I expected to see the numbers even out once you started going into higher income levels, and they don't.
Yes.
They don't. You still see racial disparities even when you leave families that are poor and you start looking at middle class, and you start looking at upper middle class and looking at upper class.
Right. And when I'm sorry.
No.
And so, the mandatory reporting that gets things started. I mean, I'm sort of, based on what you're saying, I'm supposing the answer is yes, but the implicit bias continues through the system, and it sounds like to me like you're saying the problems then just get magnified. And
yeah, they do. I mean, when you're talking about what happens to kids in the system, you're talking about initial decisions regarding removal, what happens once kids are placed, how long do the placements last? What kinds of supports are given to help parents get back on their feet? These are the kinds of issues that and get back on their feet and reunite their family. Again, I am not suggesting that the child welfare system is rife with individuals who are deliberately going out of their way to hurt Black families. That's not the claim. The claim is that, even with loads of implicit bias training, that can solve some of the problems, but it doesn't solve all of the problems. But also, when you look at the fact that the New York State system, when you talk to people who are professionals within the child welfare system in New York, they fully and firmly admit that the disparities exist and that they are terrible, and they want to see them eliminated. But despite saying that they want to see them eliminated, they don't go away. And if the people who are actually on the ground and responsible for the family breakups are saying we want them to go, we want this to go away, and then they don't successfully diminish the problem in any substantial way, it suggests that maybe the commitment to addressing the issue is not as firm as one would ideally like to see. Again, I'm not going to accuse people of openly wanting to break up families, but I do believe, based on the evidence that I have seen, based on some of the testimony that I have heard, that once kids are in the system, like once that initial determination is made, it can be hard to get kids out of the system because of assumptions about whether or not they are safe.
Okay. Well, certainly, you're describing something that seems intractable. You talk about resources. Sure, that can be a benefit across the board. Has the committee, or have you personally been able to think about ways of better addressing the implicit bias? You talk about blind process. Okay, there's some familiarity with that, but is there a way to address implicit bias, which the very term sounds like it's going to be a tough one to address?
Yeah, no, we haven't focused a lot on that. We've been focusing on, and I think part of the reason there has been less attention to it is because, one, there are consistent efforts to address it. There are consistent efforts to train people out of implicit bias, and it doesn't necessarily work. And so if the training, and that doesn't mean that the training should not happen, what that suggests is the training is not enough. And so when you are in that situation, then you have to start looking at material solutions. So what can we do with respect to representation in court? What can we do with respect to, and that question really has to do with how well you fund, attorneys who are picking up these kinds of cases in order to give them the best opportunity to defend these families and provide them with the quality of the representation that they need. There are also questions regarding, how well are we funding group homes? How well are we training the people who run the group homes? How well are we funding foster care itself? How appropriate, how well are we monitoring what happens in foster care, in foster care settings? All of these are the kinds of issues, the kinds of questions where resources can really make a difference, but there's not enough money to go around, and the problem is enormous, and there are so many problems that it can be very difficult to actually get the proper level of support that you really do need in order to address the problems really at their root, and so that you can stop all of this from happening in the first place.
Well, your committee certainly produces very thorough and very impressive reports. For some of those projects that you might have finished, like when it comes to bias in eviction. And so I have no doubt your committee will produce another impressive report. It sounds to me on the foster care issue like you're still in the process of gathering and analyzing data. And so therefore, you could have some initial impressions about what might be done. They might be quite accurate. But, it sounds like that's a bit premature as you continue to take testimony and otherwise analyze data. So is that the process on this particular
Yeah.
where you are? So you maybe tell us a little bit about this all important data gathering and analysis.
Oh, it's enormously important. We started off by inviting experts in to explain the legal framework that we were dealing with, because none of us are experts in the child welfare system. And I wouldn't presume to call myself an expert in child welfare now. I just know a little bit more about it now. But we had people come in and talk about one, the way the child welfare system works, how kids are removed, et cetera. Two, we had people come in and testify about the scope of the disparities, the impact on families, in particular, the impact on children who are removed from their families. We had people talk about, the grossness in the disparities and the lack of a good justifying reason for the grossness of those disparities. So we started off with that. And then over time, we had people come in. We had people come in from the government to talk about it. We had people come in from, we had academics come in, academics who both, so I shouldn't say both because there are multiple positions, but we had people who advocate for abolition to come in and talk to us. We had people come in who advocate for reform. We had people come in who don't particularly believe that the system needs to be reformed with an eye toward addressing the disparities, because they are not convinced that the disparities are a problem. The problem is with the families and not with the system. So we had people come in, and that's the perception. So we had people come in and talk about all of these kinds of issues. And beyond that, we also are going to do a field trip next week. It won't be all of us, it will only be some of us, but we are going to go to family court and observe some of what happens in family court during these child removal processes. So, that's the work that we are doing at the moment. Our investigatory stage is going to close in August. And after that, we are going to begin debriefing and going back over the enormous amount of material that we have gathered thus far and talk in committee about what we understand from the testimony that we received about what seems to be the problem, and then ultimately what recommendations we want to make regarding this issue. And the recommendations, as a technical matter, go to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Now, that's who we are. And just as a clarifying point, I am not speaking for the committee. I am speaking for myself here in all this, the entire conversation. But I should have said at the top. In any event, we make these recommendations to the commission because we are described as their eyes and ears on the ground with respect to the existence of potential civil rights problems. But other actors have access to our reports. So we fully expect that there will be state legislators who read the report that we generate as well. And the hope is that after doing all of this work and collecting all of this evidence, all of this data, that it will give legislators a tangible hook to hang their hats on with respect to proposing different kinds of reform strategies.
Well, I think it's it's very important. I mean, you've made a couple of really fascinating points. First of all, you do invite people in who don't see the problem. I mean, you want to hear, I guess, their perspective as well. But that there's specific amounts of time set aside to digest this information, because I suppose it's very difficult to gather and digest at the same time. I mean, that's just who could do that. So that's difficult. and of course we respect your speaking for yourself. Ultimately, there'll be a report. I would like to tell our listeners, these reports are very impressive. Again, they are reports, they're advisory committees, on a state-by-state basis that ultimately go to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. They're available. People can read them. I guess the most recent completed report on eviction, bias in eviction, that's an impressive, very detailed. I mean, you really have to respect the work that goes into it, and hope it's cited, early and often as people speak to try to remedy these problems. And when do you hope to produce? Is there a schedule for a final report? Is it sometime in 2024 or later, or?
We are hoping to produce this by, I don't remember the exact deadline, but given the way that we operate, I presume that a report will be complete probably by mid-2024.
Okay. Well, that would be impressive. For the students listening, to get involved, maybe one way to get involved is an internship with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So any student interested can research that. They might also get involved in some family court internships, which I mentioned is going to be one of your field trips. As we draw to a close, and there's no real time pressure for this to be done in one sentence, I invite you to leave us really with any thoughts that you'd like us to take away from this podcast.
I think that we're living through a moment right now where there is a great deal of pushback against the idea of structural racism. In the post-civil rights world, in a world where we have eliminated de jure discrimination, it can become very frustrating for people to hear on a regular basis that all of the work that has been done since the 1960s, in particular, to try to uproot discrimination in its formal manifestations has not been successful. There is a temptation, and at this point in time, a real desire to rest on the conclusion that to the degree that problems exist, that you kind of have to blame the people to whom the problems are happening. And at some point, the government just can't fix it. The law just can't fix it. People have to fix themselves. And what I would say to that is, I think that it's important to recognize that the problems were not created overnight. They were created over centuries. And all of our goodwill notwithstanding, all of our good efforts notwithstanding, there are habits of culture, there are habits of mind that we grow up with, we aren't aware of, that we reproduce, and we reproduce them within the systems where we work, the systems where we operate. And what that means is even when people are in fact responsible for their own fate and have made errors for which they need to be held accountable, they can be magnified by the fact that we do not yet live in a world where all of the consequences of the bad things that happened before have been eliminated from the world in which we live. And I think that the child welfare system is an extraordinary example of the way that that works out. I'll just go back to what I said before. In order to conclude that the disparities in child removal, as between Black and white families in particular, are fair, neutral, objective, and earned, you have to think that there is something that is particularly wrong with Black people as Black people. And that can't be right. I know it's not right. I mean, I know it's not right from a subjective perspective, but I also know it's not right from an objective perspective. And so when you have that understanding, then you have to say, okay, if they're not the problem, if they are not the core of the problem, then what is the problem? And that's when I think you have to take seriously the claim that we have not truly reformed the way that rules and policies and organizations operate with each other in order to produce some of the outcomes that have a negative impact on Black families' lives. Again, I'm not going to take accountability off the table because that would be unrealistic and that would be unfair. It just wouldn't be accurate to take that off the table, but it's equally inaccurate, and if not more so, to disregard the way that structures are operating in order to produce the outcomes that we see. And so that's what I would leave everyone with, just paying attention or trying to become aware of the things that are happening under the surface that we don't necessarily see, but nonetheless can wreck people's lives.
All right. Well, I thank you very much for not only those closing remarks that certainly give us a lot to think about, but also your entire presentation, which has certainly addressed a very significant issue. Again, our guest has been Dean and Professor TIffany Graham. She has spoken with us about her work on the New York Advisory Committee, which addresses ultimately the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. They've done many issues. This one was about disparity in the foster care system. So thank you again, Professor Graham. I've been your moderator, Peter Zablotsky. We're colleagues here at the Touro Law Center.
Thank you for having me.